Salam and peace, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of My Voice's Race Against Racism. My Voice is a youth-led initiative for the youth and by the youth. I'm your co-host, Mariam Khan.
And I am Mariam Mendes. Today we have a very special episode for you. As we cover the racism against Black people, we must look at all humanity and see where does this racism in general stem from. Today's episode, The Racism Within, explores racism with a few different ethnicities. With us today are two very different people with different ethnicities.
I would like to introduce Sister Bhavana Kamil, who is a philosophy professor of Indian descent, and she specializes in issues of social justice and race. She's also an active member of MAS, or the Muslim American Society, as well as several other local community organizations. I would also like to introduce Brother Buna Mohammad, who is an award-winning Canadian spoken word artist and a writer originally from Ethiopia. Buna is the founder of Safina Media, which is an Islamic media production company, and he has continued the art of storytelling through various platforms of media. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for coming. So, in the past few weeks, we have seen racism at its ugliest. It is not new, but it took another ugly incident of the brutal murder of George Floyd for us to realize how the human race has gone. I would like to ask you all this. What kind of racism have you witnessed in your own communities for each other and for other races? Sana, how about you first?
Go ahead, sister. Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman So I think, first of all, sometimes when we think about racism, we think about personal attitudes and personal experiences. I'm sure, as we'll talk about over the course of the show, when I think of racism, I think more in terms of systemic issues, that it might be hard to pinpoint an exact incident, but you can sort of see on a large scale in terms of education and health, and then more serious problems like incarceration and healthcare systems and things like that. On a personal level, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is pretty culturally diverse. I think growing up, I experienced just few incidents of racism where people, sort of personal interactions where people will yell things like "Go back to your country" and "Why are you here?" After I became Muslim, I would say, and started wearing a headscarf, I think the incidences were more frequent. On the other hand, like I said, I still live in a pretty culturally diverse area, and I don't experience it as much as people may in other parts of the country, and I certainly don't experience it as much as maybe someone of a different race or ethnicity may be experiencing it.
Yeah, 100%. Brother Buna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely there is the personal, perhaps, nuances that we have in interacting with the Muslim community. Definitely racism as a structure, I experience and deal with as a Black man, even my entire life, going to school. Many young Black men are streamlined into, lower academic classrooms because, we're kind of taught to believe that we're not as intelligent. I have umpteenth amount of friends and family who have had incidences with the justice system, who have been arrested, who have been unfairly, myself included, unfairly, sometimes they'll pat you down, they'll see you walking with a group of young men, and all of a sudden that becomes a threat. And so there's this immediate need to police and secure Black bodies, making sure that we're not a threat to the white infrastructure. I think on a personal level, and I think that's partly the conversation maybe we're having today, is that being a Black Muslim in a predominantly non-Black Muslim community, where the majority of the Muslims where I live in Toronto are, whether they're from the subcontinent, whether they're from, they're Arab of some sort, we find that there are a lot of anti-Black sentiments that exist in many of these communities. And it can stem from everything as it seems that it would be as minute as, parents' preferences for their children to marry. That's one that we often hear. Another one that I'm often talking about and exploring is even leadership in our Islamic spaces. How does leadership look? How do we look at the board of our masajid? Who are the people that we elect into power? Who are the people that govern our Islamic institutions? Oftentimes you find there is a very clear hierarchy and expectation that this particular ethnic group or this particular race will occupy these spaces. And a lot of times Black activists, Black even Muslim leaders and scholars, their Islamic knowledge is not even respected and valued. I'll give you one just quick antidote. This past Eid, there was a lot of confusion. I don't know if it was the same in the US or where you guys are from, but in where I'm from in Toronto, many East African countries had declared Eid for Saturday.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I know that caused a lot of confusion for people. And being someone who respects scholars wherever they are, and I follow kind of a global moon sighting, and the people that I respect, they said, okay, if they meet the criteria, they're people that are respectable, people that we trust, then we're okay to follow them. And so we celebrated Eid on Saturday. There were some communities, leaderships that agreed with that sentiment, people that were a part of the shura of different masajid, and they decided to celebrate their Eid on Saturday. Mind you, everyone's in quarantine. You're not actually celebrating Eid with anybody.
Yeah.
It's theoretical at this point. I'm just declaring it on behalf of my community. And I remember distinctly seeing Facebook messages on the wall of a particular masjid that were bombarded with very racially charged slurs and insults. How could we follow Africa? These people don't know anything. And it was like, subhanAllah, at a time when you just finished fasting, like you are still. And by the way, to me, this was a clear sign that Eid was on Saturday, because I said, Shaitan clearly is back, right? This is a clearly the type of hatred is coming back out of people. But just that incident alone kind of, to me, highlighted within our own bubble of the Muslim community how still we have so much work to do. Still, we have so much work to do to respect the varying opinions, especially being Muslims in the West. We have a very unique experience that we're dealing with many different Muslim philosophies and ideas, and we have to learn to kind of even respectfully disagree if we do decide to disagree. But I think specifically when it comes to Black Muslims and the Black experience, there's a lot that is inherently wrong and haram about being Black that you don't see perhaps across the board with other races or ethnic groups.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, as Brother Boonaa just explained, unfortunately, the Black community is always at the receiving end of all of this prejudice and hate, even within our Muslim community. And so I wanted to ask you, Sister Bhavna, since you have been, you are of Indian descent, but since you have been part of a Hindu community before you reverted to Islam, how has that shift for you been between, I know it's still like the Indian culture is still the Indian culture, but how was that shift? Did you see a huge difference, or do you think the culture at the end of the day still has part of that racially charged idea?
Yeah, I think what was interesting is because I came to Islam through books and through learning, and I was exposed to Islam through people, obviously, but a lot of my knowledge came through theoretical sources. I came into Islam thinking, oh my gosh, everybody will treat everybody equally, and there's no racism, and sort of all these ideals that we preach about in Islam. And then coming to the Muslim community was sort of a shock. So of course there's prejudice and racism within the Hindu community. There's prejudice and racism within every community. But I think what you realize when you live in various communities or exposed to various communities, that you realize that none of this prejudice actually comes from the faith itself, right? Mm-hmm. All of it is from culture. So no matter which group you're going to be in, as long as people are following sort of cultural mores or cultural norms, you're gonna experience that kind of racism. And so I was pretty dismayed to see that. And just to sort of follow up a little bit on what Brother Boonaa was saying, I think there's like this question of authenticity when it comes to Black Muslims. Like often when Black Muslims will come to the masjid or come into a space which is predominantly non-Black, there will be an assumption that they're a convert, first of all, right? And this is really interesting for me, especially because I am a convert, and there's never an assumption made about me because I'm brown and because I've come from a South Asian background, right? So I sort of call myself like a stealth convert. No one really knows that I am, but Black folks, even if they're not, there's always that assumption. And then even if they're not, as Brother Boonaa was saying, there's this question as to the merit, the authenticity of their scholarship, of their knowledge. I see a lot of efforts, even when people make, I think, efforts with good intentions to reach out to, let's say, a predominantly immigrant masjid will reach out to a predominantly Black masjid. It's always like patronizing, like, let's go and start programs there. Let's teach them this, teach them that, as if there is this knowledge and authenticity, right, of who's really Muslim. And I think all of us are are subject to that. Like if in the media, even if in the American media, all you see are light-skinned Arab Muslims, when Muslims are being discussed and talked about, even within the Muslim community, those are the impressions and the biases that we're going to have about our own community.
Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
I think especially where we bring in like the way it is portrayed, because a lot of times, and to the outside world that just sees the media, because you said you came to Islam through your own research, through books and meeting people, but for someone who isn't going to put in the time and look for that kind of stuff, then yeah, for them that's all they see. And unfortunately that's kind of left an imprint on us where we think, yeah, that is what the right Muslim looks like, or that is what we're supposed to look like, or that's what how it works, when it really isn't the reality. And when we were talking yesterday, you brought this up that like the majority of Muslims in America are from the Black community, because, and they always are there, and they're super passionate people, like mashallah, but there's always this disconnect between, they're not all the way there somehow, which is really sad to see.
Yeah, and even the language sometimes we use, and maybe, I mean, Buna can speak to this better than I can, but we'll use this language like they, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, you know, again, I'm a philosophy professor, so I pay attention to language and ideas. And when we say like they, it means like, wait, they're not us, right? Because you may, you know, talk about a different community and include them when we say us, right?
Yeah.
But when we talk about Black Muslims, for some reason, it's like they as if they're separate. So even in our minds, we're that this is a separate entity, a separate group, right? Whereas we don't necessarily do that with a lot of other like sort of ethnic or racial groups within the Muslim community.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see everyone, like even when there's issues about Palestine or China, like we always see this is the Muslim Ummah and we're all fighting for the same thing, you know, to free Palestine, to get Muslims out of concentration camps, even though we're not all of the same race. But then when it comes to racism, especially here in America, it's not seen as like protesting for the like rights of Black people. That's not part of like, oh no, that's not our issue. Like, yeah, we can support them, but it's not really like our thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, actually, just to touch on that, you find a lot of people, especially within this, you know, the kind of rejuvenation of Black Lives Matter and the, you know, obviously the untimely passing of George Floyd. There's a lot of Muslims who are talking more about, you know, injustices and Black Lives Matter and these great, you know, heavy topics. It's perfect, fine. But I find, like, especially on my social media networks, I don't know how it is for you guys, but I find a lot of people still in that space will be like, okay, but also don't forget Kashmir and don't forget Palestine. And to me, that's like the equivalent of saying all lives matter, right? That's basically the same thing. It's like in the same breath, you cannot appreciate Black suffering without including your own people or someone else in it. I heard someone give a great analogy the other day where they said that that feeling of constantly needing to piggyback off the suffering of Black people.
Yeah.
It's like losing your own father, having someone in your family pass away, your own father dies, and someone comes to the funeral and says, well, my father also died. You know, my father died a few years ago. Don't forget about him. It's like in that moment of grief, we can't even have that. We can't even have that experience of properly being able to vent our frustration without people needing to piggyback off of it and remind us of Palestine. Trust me, we know about Palestine. Palestine is not a new issue. In fact, I'm banned from Palestine. Okay, I'm not even allowed to go to Palestine because I tried to go to do humanitarian work. So it's not like we are outside the realm of what's happening in the rest of the world. I know about the Uyghur Muslims. I've done many fundraisers and programs for Burma, for Syria. When it comes to the Ummah, it seems like Black Muslims are always being told that, yes, we need to connect. These are your brothers and sisters. But it's like when it's reversed and there's an issue happening, whether it's police brutality or otherwise, it's almost like, well, that's a non-Muslim issue.
Yeah.
And then
it
takes people like me, and it kind of circumvents our identity. It tells us that, no, you're Muslim, you're not Black. But,
yes, one or the other.
But when police pull me over, they don't ask, like, you know, where are you from? They don't ask about my ancestry. They don't ask about any of that, right? Like, I look a certain way. I have a son who is 5 years old who I worry about. I say one day he's going to be a threat. You know, he's 5 years old. I look at him and I say one day someone is going to see him as a threat. And it's scary as a parent to have that feeling that not only are you not wanted, you're wanted dead. You know, you're wanted, as they say, dead or alive. Like it's either you're completely, on board with the system. You nod your head, you smile anytime anyone says anything of you. We were always told this. We were always taught that if you go to school, if you don't wear a hood, if you dress a certain way, you won't be subjected to that type of violence. But now we're finding with George Floyd in broad daylight.
Yeah, with witnesses and everything.
He's not wearing some type of disguise or anything. All the things that they used to tell us that if you do this, you're going to
comply. All of that just didn't work.
In front of people, in front of dozens of people. The police didn't even have shame to hide it. It wasn't even like they would go to an alleyway or something. It was like, no, we don't care, right? So it's like, what at this point can we do to protect ourselves?
Yeah, no, I think, and going back to your earlier point, there's a time and a place for everything. And when the Black community is suffering, I think the whole Muslim ummah, the least we can do is the Muslim ummah. Like, we all come together on the one belief of Islam. And so that should be enough. And our religion constantly tells us to love each other and to come together as one. And so if the Black community is suffering, let's focus on that and let's work on fixing that. And I think, like I said, like the Muslim community, like we share a different bond, and we should be able to, if we can't, trust anyone else to be doing the right thing, I think the least we can do is talk about our own and like fix our own, whatever our communities have, our racial communities of racism and whatever the implicit biases are, to try and fix that first. And so I wanted to ask, what do you guys think are some positive and productive solutions to get some of the, just whatever, like the rooted hatred that's kind of there? And sometimes it's not even hatred, it's just a certain ideology or bias has been passed down so many times that now it's just a cultural thing, or it's just part of the way, people speak. What do you think are some, because again, you don't want to be disrespectful, especially when it's the older generations in the community, and sometimes people are just ignorant and they don't know. So what are some positive and productive ways we can start addressing these problems in our own racial communities?
That's a great question that probably requires like many months of discussion and work. But there's a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. I'll just translate it in English. Or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Whosoever of you sees an evil, let them change it with their hand, and if they are not able, then with their tongue. If they are not able, then in their heart." And that is the weakest, or like the lowest sort of level of faith, right? I think that's a really great template for anything. When I think about Islamic activism, I think this is the model. And I'll try to make this quick, but I think the first steps, usually in this hadith, people focus on the second part, like change it with, and then etc. But the first part is whosoever sees an evil. And I think a lot of us don't really see the evil for what it is. So I think the first part is really raising awareness and teaching people, what is this evil we're seeing, right? It's not a bad apple. It's not like this, not all cops are bad. Like, that's not the response to what's happening, right? Yes, maybe not all cops are bad, but that's not the point. The point that this cop could, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, put his knee on this man's neck while being recorded and look at the camera and not feel a compulsion to stop, tells you that he felt completely protected and safe in doing what he was doing, that he knew the system would protect him, right? So it's not just one bad cop. This is a system that protects people who will carry out these injustices and these murders. So, so the first step, I think, is just educating the community about what the issue really is. And you have people still within our community who will say, oh, all lives matter, and why are they being violent, and blah, blah, and not really paying attention to the fact that this is a systemic problem that has started from before the official founding of this country. From the time the first settlers stepped onto this country, this has been a problem. So racism is systemic, rooted in a thirst for power and money. So I think recognizing the problem and having a lot of education around that, getting to know our history. I'm here in America. We have a lot of atrocities in our history, none of which we have really owned up to. I mean, if you look at our history books, some are doing a little bit better, but I was taught the myth of the Pilgrims and the Indians had a lunch together and it was so happy, and that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving, right? Yeah. I mean, so I think recognizing the nature of the problem, and then all those things. Yeah, and then those three things, right? And I sort of go in reverse order, that change it within your heart. So there's tests you can take online to recognize your own implicit biases. There are so many lists right now that say, watch this movie, read this book, read this article. So start somewhere. You don't have to be an expert. Just start with one thing. Start with, books or articles. And then with your tongue, so speak out if you see other people saying something that contradicts like anti-racist, contradicts ideas of justice and equality between people. And then action, I mean, there's so many ways you could get involved. If you can't get involved physically and volunteer, you can just donate money to organizations that are doing this work on the ground. And again, there's a lot of lists out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really know how to teach people to not be racist. I think the sister made a lot of good points. I don't even know if it's my job to do so. I feel like anyone who is a practicing Muslim, anyone who says La ilaha illallah, and the sister alluded to this beautiful hadith. Another hadith I always think about, subhanAllah, is when the Prophet ﷺ taught us that whoever has an atom's weight of arrogance in their hearts will not enter Jannah. A person who walks upon this earth, and remember, arrogance was the original sin. This was the sin of Iblis. All right. A person who walks along this earth thinking they're better than other people. It's really a disease of the heart that potentially could be someone's damnation. Like, subhanAllah, if somebody lives this way. And we see this, by the way, all throughout the Muslim world. This is not to be stereotypical, but if you look throughout the Muslim world, there is this notion of certain countries are better than other countries. Certain tribes are better than other tribes. Certain nations are better than other nations, right? This is something that is inherent in many of these cultures. And it's sad. I mean, if you go to the Haram, if you go to even the Kaaba, and you look at the makeup and the breakup of Saudi Arabia and how the country functions, I always think of, subhanAllah, the force of Bengali men who are cleaning the Haram every day. And it's like, this is their like cultural job. Like, this is the ceiling that they're allowed to reach, right? You never ask, like, why aren't there Saudis working in maintenance work? Why aren't there? And it's almost ingrained in the culture and society to say, well, no, this is what we are. We're better than these people. This is what they do, right? And this is in the holiest of places. I don't know. This is in front of the Kaaba. People live with this attitude. So I more fear for people's own akhirah, for their own time in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when they will have to answer for what they did and what they believed, right? That when you read the Quran and you understand the story of Iblis, that he was angry at Adam alayhi salam because he said Adam is from teen, right? Adam is from dirt, and I am from a smokeless fire. I'm better than him. And yet we, the ones who are all from dirt, we have the audacity to then look down on other types of dirt. We're all from dirt, right? And so it's ironic that we are from the lowest form of creation, yet we somehow feel like we can be better than others when we and just to piggyback off what you said earlier, even this notion that as Muslims, our first course of action should be to focus on Muslim issues and even fixing racism within our own community, which I understand and I get that sentiment. But I would go a step further and say that actually Islam teaches adl. Islam is teaching justice from the beginning. It's the reason why the Prophet ﷺ, it was a mercy to all mankind. And there's so many narrations, so many hadith about I'm even remembering the story of Ali when he was the Khalifa and a Yahud, a man from I believe it was a man from Bani Israel, came to him. And there was some business disagreement, and for whatever reason, Ali told him, "Okay, we'll take it to the courts." And so you have the leader of the Muslim nation up against this, regular guy, and Ali ends up losing the agreement of the judge. And to the astonishment of the man, he's like, "How is this possible? How am I? Imagine taking the prime minister or the president to court, and the president loses. You'll be like, what? How did that happen, right?" But that's what Islam teaches. It's not about status. It's not about who you are. It's about what's fair and what's right. And I think we have to go the extra mile as Muslims. We have to go the extra mile as people who say La ilaha illallah, who believe that we will be held accountable for our actions, that we have to stop and call out injustice when we see it, that it's not good enough for us to kind of passively, someone in your family makes a sly joke about whatever race and you say, oh, it's fine, whatever. They're ignorant, they're old. Right, this is their akhirah. You're leaving them to hang, right? Like, subhanAllah. Like, don't you wish that they would correct that behavior so that they would show up in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a clean heart? Maybe that could be the thing that sends them to the hellfire, subhanAllah. Like I think about it in those ways that for me, it's I want to do this to help the people that really feel this way. Like you really think you're better than me?
Yeah.
Like what about you is so fascinating that your ethnic group, you came from one refugee camp, I came from the other. Now we're all in America. Who's better? Like how could you possibly say you're better than me? So this is an attitude I think we as Muslims in the West, we actually have an opportunity to correct. Because people who live in homogenous communities, Muslims in India or in Africa, many places, you don't even have that opportunity to feel that way, right? But here we have an opportunity to correct a wrong when we see it in front of us. And I think that's a unique position that we have to take advantage of.
Yeah, we need to.
And I think, sorry, I just wanted to say something, but I think the two things that both of you brought up were very different. And I haven't heard like this kind of way of attacking the problem, which is, to, like Brother Buna said, look at it with just the way that our own religion presents it. Is if you have any arrogance, then that is what may prevent you from having a good hereafter. And I think just putting it in that light in front of people who in your life do behave in a racist way or in a prejudiced way, then I think that's really important just to show it to them that way. Because sometimes, that understanding is not there of the humanitarian perspective of it, or just because we've grown up here, we've seen certain things, we do feel more strongly. But I think presenting it in this way is definitely a good move. And then also what Sister Bhawana was saying about just educating yourself, because I think the more you look into this, because now I think the biggest thing that happened with this was that we were all in the quarantine, so we all had so much time to just reflect over this and see what's going on. And people have been putting a lot of effort into sharing the knowledge and putting it out there to see, like this is what's going on. And I think that was really a wake-up call for a lot of people. So I think both of those things are very important solutions.
Yeah. The only sad thing is that people are seeing that change needs to happen, but us as human beings and Muslims aren't doing anything to really stop it. So why do you think, like in our community of Black people, Mr. Boonaa, or we're unable to change the narrative for Black people? And where do you think this racism is stemming from?
I think the vast majority of times you can trace it just simply to ignorance. Like if people really don't know the legacy of Islam in Africa, they haven't studied Islam. You can't tell me confidently that, and I've heard it. Wallahi, I've heard people will say like, oh, the Sahabas, or this Sahaba comes from India, or he comes from this place. And you don't realize that Africa was in the mix from the beginning. Right, the history and legacy of Islam, and the sister mentioned that she's kind of a stealth convert. People don't question her Islam. People constantly question my Islam. People are constantly asking me, brother, when did you revert? Do you know I've been Muslim since the time of Bilal? Do you know that this is where my ancestry comes from? We are from the people of Habash. That this is like, there's no one after us. It's us, and we even beat most of the Quraysh. We were there from the beginning. So that in and of itself is a knock against your own knowledge if you don't exemplify the understanding that Africa as itself, as a continent, has been such an ally to Islam. And Africa from the beginning has been, if you look at where the Prophet ﷺ sent his family, right? When he made that first hijrah, they sent him to Abyssinia. Why? Because there was a just ruler who the Prophet ﷺ said he trusted. And this man became, we know when he passed away, the Prophet ﷺ even prayed janazah over him. So he died as a Muslim. There's so much history and legacy with Africa that it just baffles my mind that people would somehow paint it as a backwards, uneducated, it's a place of miskin people. And yes, there's much poverty in Africa. It's not like I'm going to deny that, but there is so much wealth and knowledge and history and legacy that I think, especially as Muslims, we need to celebrate at a time when, Africans were being stolen from their lands. I don't know how many Americans know this, but at a time when Africans were being stolen and brought to America, there is some scholars differ as to the exact percentage, but between 30, I've even heard 70% of the slaves who were brought to the Americas were Muslim. When you understand and you trace back the legacy of the people who live and occupy the United States today, African American people, how would you feel when you understood that many of their ancestors were Muslims who were stolen? They were political prisoners. Their identity, their names, and their deen was taken away from them. How would you view them in that way if you understood that these were your brothers and sisters who were taken away from you? I feel an immense amount of responsibility and almost sadness when I think about the sheer lack of effort we have put into giving dawah and reaching back out to these communities, because once we understand how much they've gone through, as an African, I'm the child of immigrants, as refugees who came to Canada, but I have a level of disconnect from, for example, African Americans or Canadian, or African Canadians as we would have here, right? Because they have a disconnect from their culture that I don't necessarily have, that I can at least trace back and understand, where my family came from, where that's been taken from them. Shouldn't we feel obliged and obligated to then? And by the way, as immigrants, because most of us are immigrants, right? People who are watching, the Muslim community, do we not realize the only reason you're in this country is because it's on the back of the civil rights movements? It's off the back of the work that African American people have done for human rights and civilization and liberation of all people, that now you're able to enjoy the luxury that you enjoy. It's off the backs of these people. America is off the back of these people, right? So I think on many different levels, we as Muslims, people who are anti-racist or working against racism, we need to educate our fellow brothers and sisters. I think that's the key. That's where it stems from. We need to educate them on the history of Islam, on on Africa's contribution to Islam, how many great scholars over time were African, how many of the companions were African. I did a series in the month of Ramadan with a sheikh named Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick, who is a world-renowned historian and has written many books on Islam and history. And we did a series on Islam in East Africa. And it would boggle your mind to know the amount of legacy just in East Africa alone that has contributed to the growth and proclamation of Islam around the world. That when you understand how many people know Sumayya radiallahu anha, Sumayya, the first shaheed in Islam, was a black woman.
She missed her life,
and she was a shaheed. She was the first person to lose her life for this deen. And she was a black woman. The Prophet ﷺ used to have a dry nurse by the name of Ayman, Baraka. Her name was Baraka Ayman. It was her kunya. And she was a woman who the Prophet ﷺ used to call her and refer to as Ummi. He used to say, this is like my mother. And she was a black woman. To me, it's like when you study the history, there's no way you can come to that conclusion without a conscious effort and prejudice and bias that you I'll end with this. I know I'm taking a lot of time, but I'm just very passionate about this, and it gets me frustrated. But I was on a conference call recently, and a brother who's a scholar in the UK, he was telling us that many of the scholarly criteria for knowing if a hadith is fabricated or not, one of the criteria, Ibn Jawzi, he mentions this in his book, one of the criteria to know if a hadith is completely fabricated is if it mentions anything negative about black people. This is aslan one of the criteria. Automatically, it is fabricated. Because there's no way in any of schools of thoughts that the Prophet ﷺ would ever refer to people of African origin or black people in any negative light. There's no historical evidence to back any of that up. So he says that this is one of the ways, automatically, once you see a hadith, if a hadith says, oh, black people, he's like, oh, khalas, that's it. It's fake, right? To that extent, we see the contributions and the love the Prophet ﷺ had for all people, that it baffles my mind. I don't really know how people get to those conclusions.
Yeah, if people took the time to look into this, to gain knowledge and to really understand what black people went through and what they did for Islam, they would be a lot more appreciative of black people. So
yeah. I think the other thing, and I'll try to make it quick, but subhanAllah, I mean, I've seen time and time again, first of all, what Boonaa is saying is absolutely, I agree with him 100%, right? Like these stories, these narratives need to be put at the forefront so that people know them. What I've seen through experiences, in addition, is even if you give people all this education, it may not always change their heart, right? And you see this about a lot of different issues. in the US, right? You like throw education at people and information at people, it might just slide off of
Yeah, you
them,
guys have an
right?
education problem. We need to fix that.
No, we do. We need to
100%,
start in the school with elementary
Yep.
and work from there. We need good teachers who will
Yeah.
explain this, but we don't have
I
them.
mean, we have a big education issue, right? But even if you give them the proper education, like as adults, you give people proper information and knowledge and education, sometimes that won't stick. And a lot of that has to do with biases that people already have. And these biases, again, come from the community you live in, they come from society. So you're given information. I'm seeing right now on social media, I actually have some friends I didn't know who were sort of on the other side of this, and why are they rioting, and but Black people did this and whatever. And I'm seeing that no matter how many facts you give them, numbers, they won't accept it because they have already ingrained with them biases that have come from living in a society that is always giving biased messages. And my perspective, at least, and from Kendi, he talks about the idea that attitudes stem from power structures, and they have actually been created to reinforce existing power structures, right? So you can change somebody's attitude, sure. That won't necessarily stop a Black man from getting killed by the police officer, right? But if you change these systems, then some of the attitudes will also start going away, because the attitudes have only been created to reinforce power structures that uphold, wealth and power for those who are in those positions. So, I think education is important, but also recognizing that every single person will have biases, and that education won't really change our heart until we do the work of changing our heart, recognizing what's in our own heart, and trying to change that. But I think also our focus shouldn't be limited to just attitudes. It has to be actual work to change systems which give rise to those attitudes. Because I am certainly concerned, this is a very wonderful perspective that I'm learning from Buna about, like, being concerned for even people's own akhirah, right? But we're also concerned about people's lives and people's welfare. And I feel like as a Muslim, it has been our Muslim community has been charged with the legacy of the prophets. And part of that legacy is to protect our community, right? No matter what faith, no matter what background, to protect any member of our community from any injustice. And if I'm really concerned about that change isn't just going to come through changing attitudes. You really have to challenge systems. So I think both, either one can't work without the other. You have to attack.
Yes,
You have
to
to
balance of both of them.
Yeah, I think it's that mix of education, which is definitely needed for some people who are in ignorance, and then the attitude has to change, and then work has to be put in those steps.
Yes.
I really want to thank you guys for coming on today and for all of the new perspectives and wisdom that you added to this discussion. I'd also like to thank the whole My Voice team for all the effort and time that they put into making this run so smoothly and making this such a productive series. And I just want to thank everyone for their time and effort once again. Thank you for watching our My Voice's Race Against Racism. Assalamu alaikum.